This is lesson 955 in Imperialism in China and Japan. China was a largely self-sufficient country as the Industrial Revolution took shape in the West. They had advanced agricultural techniques, they had extensive mining and manufacturing, equal to that of Western Europe. They had a huge population and therefore a huge consumer market. Imperialism in China, the Opium Wars, 1839 to 1842. China produced a lot of things that Europeans wanted, such as porcelain, silks, and especially tea. The English drank an amazing amount of tea. It's really difficult to trade with somebody who has lots of things you want, but who doesn't want anything you have. And you wind up exporting all of your gold and silver to them because everybody takes gold and silver. But then that depletes your money resources. Britain also wanted access to that huge Chinese market for their manufactured goods. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, their need for markets to sell all that stuff was huge. And they proposed new trade agreements to China. Manufactured goods for manufactured goods. China had very little use for European manufactured goods. It all seemed really lame and useless to them. The Qing emperor even wrote to King George III and told him exactly that. He called British products like clocks and globes, etc., gadgets. The British were really insulted by the Chinese emperor's blunt refusal to formalize large trade agreements with Great Britain. Then Britain found a solution to the problem: opium. Opium was an addictive and dangerous drug. It was totally illegal in Britain, but this was China, so who cared? The British arranged to start selling opium to China. Through third-party traders and dealers, of course. They didn't want to look bad. By 1835, they had 12 million Chinese people addicted to opium. And Britain used the cash from these opium sales to pay for all the other Chinese products that they wanted. So the British were selling something to the Chinese that was totally illegal in their own country. And the fact that the British were selling to the Chinese something that was totally illegal in their own country was not lost on the Chinese. The Chinese government finally outlawed opium dealers. The British were deeply offended and outraged by this Chinese effort to protect their own people from British opium. Great Britain declared war against China for daring to disrupt their opium trade, and this was called the Opium Wars, and Great Britain easily won. And we come back to the mandate from heaven. We've talked about the mandate from heaven a couple of times already. Well, the Qing dynasty apparently could not keep China safe and prosperous. There was out-of-control population growth. Food production was not keeping up with this growth. There was widespread opium addiction, and foreign invaders were forcing trade with China. And many Chinese saw all of these things as a sign that the Qing dynasty had lost its mandate from heaven. Lose your mandate from heaven, and what happens? A man named Hong Xiuquan organized a massive number of peasants, and he rebelled against the Qing dynasty and set up a peasant kingdom that lasted many years. This event was called the Taiping Rebellion, and it lasted from 1850 to 1864. The Qing government managed to put it down, with European help, of course. The assistance with the Taiping Rebellion made Europe much more powerful in China. The winners, the European powers, divided China into what they called spheres of influence. But the U.S. advocated for equal access to all Chinese markets for all Western powers. In other words, the U.S. said that China should not be divided into separate European colonies. These colonies would restrict open trade. And the U.S. proposed the open door policy in 1899. Other Western powers agreed to it, and this at least kept China from being reduced to separate European colonies. The Boxer Rebellion, 1899 to 1900. The Boxers wanted to rid China of foreigners and Christians, and they rose up and fought savagely. They managed to kill hundreds of foreigners living in Chinese cities. European powers and the U.S. sent an international military coalition to put the Boxer Rebellion down. Here's a painting of U.S. troops storming the walls of Beijing during the Boxer Rebellion. This Western coalition brutally crushed the Boxer Rebellion. Imperialism in Japan. Japan had practiced isolationism for 300 years. And finally, the U.S. forced Japan to trade in 1853. They sent in warships under Commodore Matthew Perry to open up trade with Japan by means of military intimidation. This tactic is often called gunboat diplomacy. Here's a picture of the real Commodore Perry, and here's a picture of the anime Commodore Perry. Japan had already seen what had happened to China, so they opened their doors to trade. The Meiji Restoration, 1868 to 1912. Japan felt vulnerable to Western imperial powers. Emperor Meiji was convinced that if you wanted to avoid being dominated by imperialists, you had to become like them. The Meiji imported industrial methods and technology to modernize Japan. They sent Japanese scholars all over the world to learn Western ways. They adopted a new constitution, and they copied what Western powers were doing. The Japanese Empire. The Japanese developed very rapidly, and Japan emerged as the only Asian industrial power. Japan became a powerful empire itself, and we all know what that led to. Queen Victoria of England, 1837 to 1876. Queen Victoria personified British imperialism. She personified an entire era of British art, culture, fashion, and intellectual development. She ruled the British Empire for 64 years, and her many titles included Empress of India, Queen of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. However, Queen Victoria also supported the introduction of social reforms and charitable programs to improve the lives of the poor. Queen Victoria's empire covered 20% of the Earth's surface.